Hey, Doc Steve here, and I want to tell you the story of Roberto Orozco-Ramírez, who, along with his family, his wife and 4 sons, they make up about half of the entire non-white population of a very small, rural Montana town that is overwhelmingly white and conservative. I say heartwarming because despite being different from pretty much everybody in the town, the family is completely accepted and integrated into the community. Their kids play sports together. Roberto has coached Little League. He and his family have lived there for more than 10 years, and he's built up a business as a diesel mechanic, which some of the people in the town say is a godsend because the closest diesel mechanic besides him is something like an hour away. There's many stories of him being self-sacrificial for the community, including the time in the winter when he spent the whole night trying to fix the heating system on the school bus so the kids wouldn't be cold going to school. And you know what? It gets pretty darn cold in Montana in the winter. So heartwarming, but also heartbreaking because Roberto is undocumented. And he's not the simple kind of first-time offense undocumented. A first-time offense being in the country illegally is almost not a crime in this country. It's on the same level as loitering or disorderly conduct or making excessive noise, which, if you ask my wife, I'm pretty much guilty of every day. But Roberto was deported in 2009 and returned to the country, and re-entry after deportation is a felony in this country, punishable by up to $250,000 fines, 2 years in prison, and almost certain deportation. And unfortunately and heartbreakingly, last month, Roberto was tracked down by ICE and arrested and detained. Now, I said it was heartwarming how this family was integrated into this community, but for me, that was not a surprise because for me, that's more of an American value. It's neither conservative nor liberal, and I see it with both. Obviously, it doesn't always happen, but for me, that part wasn't surprising. But what really surprised me and was actually mega heartwarming to me was how this community stood up and supported this family at this time. They did tons of practical stuff for them, including making tons of meals. They wrote their congressmen and their senators. On the day of his first hearing, about 15 of them, which makes up about 5% of the entire town, got up at 3 a.m. and carpooled their way to his hearing, which was 400 miles away, sat through the hearing, which lasted less than 10 minutes, and then drove 400 miles back. And they did this just to support him. Now, I can't think of too many people that I would do that for. It probably helps that all the roads in Montana are flat and straight, and I think the speed limit is something like 170 miles per hour, but I still don't know that I would have done that. So the community response to this has been big surprise, but also really heartwarming to me. But there's another heartbreaking part to this story as well. Because a lot of people in the town were saying things like this: we thought this deportation was about the worst of the worst, or we thought it was about violent criminals. How can it be about Roberto? His family is exactly the kind of people we want in our town. This is especially heartbreaking for me because as somebody who's been beating the drum of fact-checking for like 5 years, the fact is that if people had been listening to what their leaders were saying and fact-checking them, they would have actually known that Roberto was exactly who this deportation was targeting. And I say that because President Trump particularly, and many Republicans also, although not all Republicans, basically said that during the campaign. They didn't say it directly, but they said that during the campaign, and I'm going to show you how that happened. So during the campaign, Republicans were beating 2 main drums constantly throughout the campaign. The first one being, we're going to have a mass deportation, we're going to focus on the worst of the worst, the violent criminals, and that's who we're going to get out of our country. And the other immigration drum that Republicans were constantly beating is that sleepy Joe Biden and crazy Kamala let 13,100 undocumented murderers into this country during their terms. 13,100 is a very specific number. Where does that number come from? Well, during the summer of 2024, while the campaigns were in full swing, one of the representatives asked the Department of Homeland Security for the number of murderers on the non-detained list. Now, the non-detained list is a list of the people known to be in the country who are not currently in detention. One of the main functions of this list is to keep track of people that had committed crimes so that they can find them and deport them. In the summer of 2024, there were 13,100 convicted murderers on that non-detained list. So that's where the number comes from. Now, I did another short video on why 13,100 is probably a gross overestimate of the number of undocumented convicted murderers who are loose on the streets in our country. And there's a link to that video in my bio and also at the end of the video. But for the purposes of this video, let's just say there's 13,000. I'll give them 13,000. Time for a little math. We're going to figure out the percentage of non-citizens in this country who are known to be convicted of murder. So about 13,000 murderers. and there are 11 million undocumented people in this country. But the fact is that 13,000 number is out of everybody who's not a citizen. So it includes green card holders and tourist visas and student visas and asylum seekers. And that number is 53 million. So when you divide those two numbers out, 13,000 out of 53 million people, this is what you get. You get 1 in 4,000 non-citizens being convicted of murder in the past. And if you're talking about just deporting them, that's a pretty darn wimpy mass deportation. In fact, during Biden's term, Trump's first term, and Obama's term, massively more people were deported than that. Well, somebody's going to say there's more violent crimes than just murder, and I completely agree. Let's see how those affect the numbers. Now, at the time that Congress received that 13,000 murderer number, they also received the number that was the total number of non-citizens convicted of any non-immigration related crime, and that includes misdemeanors, felonies, and violent crimes. And that number was around 420,000. Now, for my next bit of math, I admittedly have to be a little back of the envelope because there were no other individual crimes singled out and given a number by the DHS at the time these numbers were received by Congress. So in order to come up with a number or a percentage of people in this group that had been convicted of violent crimes, I had to just use the statistics in our country for the distribution of those kinds of crimes. So here's what the statistics show. The vast majority of crime convictions in this country are misdemeanors. In fact, only a little less than a quarter of all crime convictions are felonies. Of the felonies, only a little less than a fifth are actually violent crimes. So when you multiply those two numbers together, you get the approximate percentage of crime convictions that are violent crimes, and that number is 4%. So 4% of 420,000 is about 17,000 people. And if you remember, I said that 13,000 is an overestimate of the murderers, while 420,000 is also an overestimate. So this number, 17,000, is also a significant overestimate. And you have to check out my other video to know why I'm saying that. So 17,000 is still not a mass deportation, especially when you think of it out of 53 million. That's about 3 out of every 1,000 people here who are non-citizens. And if you want to call that a mass deportation, you probably have to call it a mini mass deportation, or maybe a micro mini mass deportation, or a mini mass deportation, whatever. So my point is, at the same time that politicians were talking about mass deportation of violent criminals, if they knew how to do any kind of arithmetic at all, they also knew that the number of convicted criminals that were not citizens in this country was tiny. And that's really why this mass deportation was not about criminals. It was about people like Roberto. Well, one of the most ironic things about this, I heard a recent interview with one of the former directors of ICE and the Department of Homeland Security. And one of the things that he pointed out was that the techniques this administration is using in their immigration enforcement is not going to actually get the violent criminals. He said that their experience was when you do these Home Depot sweeps or meatpacking plants or farms or construction sites, you ID a lot of people and you find a lot of people. But guess what? The criminals aren't there. They're not here to make an honest living. They're here to make a dishonest living. You don't find those guys at the Home Depots and the construction sites. The people you're going to get there are the Robertos. In order to get the criminals, you need to do concentrated, labor-intensive police work. And that's what they did under Biden. That's what they did under Trump's first term. That's what they did with Obama. But I'll tell you, it's not clear to me that that's happening now. To be honest, this administration's policy looks to me like quantity without quality. In other words, get as many people out of the country as possible. And because you're so focused on that, the quality, in other words, the part about getting the criminals out, is going to suffer. I don't know if Roberto's story is going to have a happy ending. I hope it does, but it is a felony, and even if he escapes the prison time and the huge fines, he's probably going to be deported. This case has gotten a lot of publicity, and maybe the fact that it's from a ruby red town that really supports him, maybe there's some connections there that'll help. Maybe they'll find some kind of a loophole for him. But the fact is, even if there's a heartwarming ending to this story, this is happening in countless other towns and cities across our country, and I don't think there's going to be happy endings in all of those. Hey, I want to close with this. When politicians talk about a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, they're not talking about violent criminals. I don't care how liberal a Democrat is, that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about people like Roberto. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to check out the video on why that number 13,000 is a very significant overestimate of the number of murders actually loose on our streets, then you can click on the video. It's also in my bio. All of my other videos are at Doc Steve, all one word, on YouTube. So thanks again for watching, and see you next time.